Good morning, everyone. We are learning Mishna Chala, Perek Beis, Chapter 2, Mishna Ches, Mishna 8. I'd like to dedicate this morning's learning in memory of my mother, Mr. Shalamis Rabinowitz, Shalamis Bas Rav Yaakov Eliezer. Okay, now, before we start this Mishnah, we have to review something we learned previously in an earlier Mishnah, and that is that if somebody wants to separate challah from a dough that's tameh, from a dough that's tar, for a dough that is tameh, one may not do that. The reason is because in order to separate challah for a dough, the doughs have to be near each other. There has to be min hamukaf, they have to be nearby. And being that in this case, one is tar and one is tameh, the person separating the challah is going to be afraid for them to be too close, because if the tameh touches the tar, the challah is going to become tameh, which you're not allowed to let that happen. And therefore, people don't want to keep them separate. Because of that fear of trying to keep it separate, it may come to the point that it won't be close enough. And therefore, the sages said, that there is no separating challah from a dough that is tar for a dough that is tameh. But now we're going to see an opinion that disagrees with that. And that is Mishna Ches. Rebbe Eliezer says, Niteles minatar benatameh. You may separate from a tar dough for a tameh dough. Now, just to clarify things, as we mentioned previously, typically the way you separate challah is you have a dough, you separate challah from it. But if I want to, I can have a dough that needs challah separated from it, and I can separate challah from it for it and for another dough, as long as I take the amount that I need to for both doughs. Okay? And this is where we're having the argument that if the dough that I'm separating from is tar, I'm doing it for a dough that's tameh, that's the problem here. So Rebbe Eliezer says you can do that. It's not a problem. Not a problem. Now, Ketzad, the Mishnah then says, though, how are you going to do this? How are you going to be able to separate it properly? Now, you might say, well, what's the big deal? Make sure to, typically for min hamukif, typically for the idea of something being close by, whether it comes separating truma from one pile for another, or challah from one dough for another, one would have said, or actually I shouldn't say that. Min hamukif, right, which applies everywhere, can be in the same room, right? If I have two doughs that are pure, one's on one side of the room, one's on the other side of the room, that's considered close enough to separate challah from one for the other. So what would be the issue if one is tar and one is tameh? Why should that be any different? And the answer is because the halacha is that works to say that even though they're not touching each other, they're close enough. That works when you don't mind for the two doughs to touch each other. So being that you have no problem for them touching each other, as long as they're close by, that's good enough to make them into one unit. You don't need them for them to actual touch to make them one unit. However, in a situation where for some reason you don't want the two doughs to touch each other, in that situation, to separate from one dough for the other, they have to be touching. So therefore, in our case in the Mishnah, where you don't want the two doughs touching each other because one is pure and one is impure, you don't want them touching each other. So in that case, you need them to touch each other. But how can they touch each other? If they touch each other, then you're going to land up making the pure dough impure, which would mean the challah separated from the impure, and you're not allowed to do that. So how is it possible to do this? That's the point right now. Rebbe Eliezer says, I could separate from the tar for the tameh, from the tar dough for the tameh dough, but how can I do it? How's it possible? Answer is like this. Isa tahira of Isa tameya. I have a pure dough and an impure dough. Okay, that's the case here. One dough is pure, one dough is impure. Neitel chala kedei chala me isa shleihur machalasa. You take the amount of challah necessary from a dough that its challah was not yet separated from. Okay, so what that means is like this. What you do is that, again, if I'm going to, you start out like this. You've got the pure dough, you got the impure dough. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off. It's not going to be challah yet. I'm going to take off the amount of challah from the dough needed to cover both doughs from the dough that challah was not yet separated from. Meaning, in order for me to separate challah from one dough to another dough, the dough that I'm separating the challah from has to be a dough that itself never had challah separated from it. If you have a dough the challah was separated from, you can't just then say, oh, I'll take some of that dough for a different dough that needs challah. You cannot separate challah from a dough that's exempt from challah. In itself has to be a dough that is obligated in the separation of challah, so that I can separate it, and for something else, or for something else. That's what I need. I can't. That's a general rule. So therefore, the starting point is that when I am right now taking off a part, I'm basically setting it. I'm designating it for challah. It's not challah yet, but I'm designating it for challah. Okay. If you want this, what I'm taking off right now, to be considered challah, it has to come from a dough that the challah that didn't have a challah separated from it yet. So in our case, you're starting off with two doughs. One is pure, one is impure. The pure dough needs challah separated from it. So you're going to take from that pure dough the amount of challah needed to be challah for both doughs. You're taking it off. You're not making it challah yet. It's not challah yet. You're just taking it off. Now, next thing you do is, v'noiseng pachas mikabetza ba'emtza. Now you're going to put less than the volume of an egg of pure dough in the middle, in between both the pure dough and the impure dough. Okay? You've taken off challah from the amount, you've taken off the amount that you'll need for challah from the pure dough, which was whatever amounts that we previously learned. And then you're going to take a small piece of dough, less than the volume of an egg, and you're going to put it in between the two doughs, the pure dough and the impure dough. And this little piece of dough in the middle is going to be a bridge between the two doughs. It's going to bridge the two doughs together. Okay? So now what I have is, I've got the pure dough and the impure dough touching each other, but in a way that they don't become tamei. Because this piece of dough in the middle, it's coming from the pure piece. It's starting from the pure piece of dough. When it touches the impure dough, it becomes impure. But it cannot transfer its impurity to the pure dough, because a food that is less than the volume of an egg cannot transmit impurity. It can become impure. It can receive the impurity, but it can't transmit it to something else. If you have the two doughs themselves touching each other and they're larger than the volume of an egg, then the impure food is going to make the pure food impure. But now we're talking about, it's not that the impure dough is touching the pure dough. The impure dough is touching another piece of dough that is less than the volume of an egg. And therefore, the impurity will not transfer from the less than an egg's volume of dough to the pure dough. So now I have the doughs touching each other without making the pure dough impure. Okay, but still, there's still one point here, because in this situation where we need everything touching, the challah has to touch too. So says the Mishna, and what you're going to do? The Mishna doesn't speak this out, but this is the next part. It doesn't say it explicitly. It says, you put less than the volume of an egg in between, so that you should be able to take the challah from close by. The Bartanur explains, now that piece of dough that you had taken off to be challah, you know where you're going to put it? You're going to put it on the piece of dough that's less than the size of an egg. By putting the challah on that, will the challah become tamei? No, because a tamei food that is less than the volume of an egg cannot transmit its tumah to something else. But by now being on that piece of dough that's the bridge between the two doughs, they're all connected. They're all touching. They're all one unit, and therefore the challah can work for both. That is how Rabbi Eliezer says you can get this done. You want to get it done to separate from a tar challah to a tamei challah. This is the process. You have both challahs near each other. You're going to separate challah, the amount you need for challah, from the tar dough, the amount of challah for both. You're then going to take a piece of dough from the pure dough that's less than the volume of an egg, and put it in between both doughs so that now the doughs are connected through that small piece of dough, but the tumor will not transmit through that small piece of dough to the pure dough because it's less than the volume of an egg. And then the challah, as designated as challah, will then be put onto that piece of dough that's less than the volume of an egg, so that now everything is touching, but the things that are not supposed to become impure will remain pure. Okay? That's Rabbi Elazar's opinion. The Chachamim Eisrin. At the end of the day, the Chachamim say it's still forbidden. Although Rabbi Elazar has created this situation where it could all theoretically work out, the Chachamim were still concerned that people will be nervous about doing this. They would not make that bridge because that bridge, right, that's connecting the two things is going to be too much for people. They won't do it. And they'll actually think they can separate the challah without anything touching. And in this case, that can't work. So there, the Chachamim said, you can't do it. Rabbi Elazar is not concerned with that. Rabbi Elazar says he can do it. Is not concerned that people will still be scared and not do his solution because they'll still be too nervous and not do the bridge and then separate without the bridge. He's not that concerned. And therefore, he says this is the solution. The Chacham is still forbid, even what Rabbi Elazar says to do, and therefore, at the end of the day, they forbid it because they still think it's not going to satisfy people's fears. At the end of the day, the fear of the challah dough that's actual challah touching the tamei dough is still going to be present by people. Doing the bridge is not going to satisfy them, and therefore it's going to be further apart from each other, which cannot work in this case. And there, if they separate challah, it won't be good. And therefore, the Chachamim said no separating from the pure for the impure. If you're going to separate challah from the impure, which is what you do need to do, you're just going to go in and separate challah, although it's going to be tamei. At the end of the day, this dough is tamei already. And therefore, to separate the challah tamei is something that you can, in this situation, you're going to do. You're going to burn it, and then the rest of the dough is tamei, but it's permissible to eat. And the Chachamim halach is like the Chachamim, that there is no separating challah from a dough that is tar onto it for a dough that is tamei. Okay, we continue with the laws of Lashon Harah from the Chavetz Chaim, and actually, I want to go through today a footnote from the Chavetz Chaim. Yesterday we did Klal Test paragraph chapter 9, Sif Daled, paragraph Daled, and paragraph Daled began Asr Lador b'Shchunas Bali Lashon Harah. It's forbidden to live in a neighborhood of people who are habitual speakers of Lashon Harah. So there's a footnote here, and it's an interesting footnote. If we're not supposed to live in the same neighborhood, certainly one should understand that one should avoid do not put your seat in shul or in the base medrash in the study hall, meaning where people gather to daven. Don't have your seat next to the people who talk Lashon Harah, who have this habit of speaking Lashon Harah in shul, because they get together with their friends, so it's a good chance to have a session. If you hang around such people, problem number one is going to be that they're going to suck you in, and you're also going to start joining into the Lashon Harah. Another thing is that through this, you're going to miss out many times from answering Yeheshmei Rabbah, Ubarchu, or responding to Barchu, L'shmaya Kriyas HaTorah, or for hearing the reading of the Torah, the Chazaras Hashatz, or the repetition of the Shemona Esrei. Meaning, basically, these people who will be speaking Lashon Harah, what do you think? They only speak Lashon Harah after davening? They're going to do their speaking Lashon Harah all the time during davening itself. So basically, what you're facing here is you're sitting next to people who talk during davening. So besides the fact that they may suck you into speaking Lashon Harah with them, or into accepting Lashon Harah that they say, very often what's going to happen is, because they're going to be talking, you're going to be listening, you're going to be missing out on the parts of davening you should be listening to. Yeheshmei Rabbah, Amen, Baruch Hu, the reading of the Torah, the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, And really, this is really a point being made about sitting next to people who talk in shul, and so to speak, purposely sitting next to them, and putting yourself in a bad situation of getting involved in what they do. Now, so the first problem is davening. It's going to disturb your davening. Ubefrat, and even more, person has a set time for learning Torah. So that means the person, let's say, every day has a set time for learning Torah, and he goes to a beis medrash, to a study hall to learn. But in the study hall, you got people sitting there, getting together, and just talking Lashon Harah. So if you're sitting next to them when you're supposed to be learning, then that's going to be very, very problematic. If you have a set time for studying Torah, that means the rest of the day a person's working, but he has set time for studying every day. During that time, especially, you're going to be careful not to get involved in them, because they're going to take away from your learning. You're sitting next to these people, they're schmoozing it up, you're listening or you're joining in. You're supposed to be learning. You're going to be losing out on your learning time. That means you're losing out on Torah study. You're being mavato. You are disobeying the commandment of studying Torah. You'll pull yourself back and you'll learn a little bit. You may get a mitzvah of learning Torah by pulling yourself away and learning a little bit before you end up getting disturbed again and going back. But that's not the kind of Torah study, says the Chavetz Chaim, that you will succeed in. Because it's going to be pieces, it's going to be interrupted. Number one, interrupted learning is not the same as uninterrupted learning. It's not the same. You don't retain it. It doesn't stay with you. It doesn't influence you the way it should. And that's what the Chavetz Chaim means. If you interrupt it, you're not going to have success. Meaning now the Chavetz Chaim is saying, it's not, even if you're going to tell me that instead of, if I sit next to them, I'm not going to the whole time talk to them. I'll just some of the time talk to them, which means you'll go back to learning, and then you'll hear what they're saying. You're going to have a temptation to join them again. And then you'll catch yourself and go back and forth. That's interrupted learning. That's not the way to learn. Secondly, and the last thing he says is this very seriousness of hapaisek midivrei Torah v'aisek midivrei sicha. The idea itself of just interrupting your learning to speak about unimportant things. That itself is a very grave thing. There's one thing that your learning will be interrupted. It affects the learning. But then there's the whole act itself of interrupting your learning for the purposes for an unimportant purpose, for a vain purpose. That's a very serious thing. There's one thing if you have to interrupt your learning for something important. But to go ahead and interrupt your learning just for the sake of schmoozing around, and all the more so it's Lashon Harah, that's a very serious thing that our sages say is something that's very serious. A person should never do such a thing because that's very disgraceful, that's very disrespectful to Torah study. And that can carry with it responsibilities. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says is that, the same way he said, don't live amongst people that speak Lashon Harah, don't have your seat in shul or in the study on the beis medrash next to these people. And because of all the potential problems it can create. And the same thing would apply to people who may not be speaking Lashon Harah in shul, but who are talking during davening. That those people talking during davening or talking in a situation where people are supposed to be learning. They're going ahead and they're talking. That if you're going to be next to them, you're going to get pulled into what they're doing. And that's going to take you away from a lot of the things you should be doing. It could take you away from answering Amen, Yeshmei Rabbah, take away from your learning. And therefore, to go ahead and make your place next to them during these periods of times is definitely something that it would be forbidden to do. Have a wonderful day.